Hi everyone, my name is Premaratne. I've been coaching for the past 4 years. I was also debate captain at Dharmaraja Convent. I took part in WUDC in 2023, but that's just about it in terms of me. Now, I was told to break down the motion, this house as a feminist living in Asia supports the conflict theory. Now, within this video, I'll be breaking it down into 3 main components. First is on setup, second is on argumentation, and third on strategy and clashes. Now, in terms of setup, I think, again, you can break it down into 3 elements. First is on how the conflict theory works. Now, the core assertion of the conflict theory is that gender inequality stems from structural patriarchy. This is entrenched in social, economic, cultural, and political systems. So you can also talk about how power dynamics sustain male dominance by embedding inequality as the natural, right? This theory essentially highlights systemic barriers, shifting focus away from isolated incidents to the power structures that reproduce inequality. Now, another thing that you need to talk about is the Asian context. Now, Asia has its unique challenges. Obviously, deep-rooted patriarchal norms, the caste system, the class hierarchies, religious orthodoxy, and communalism, all of these things essentially provide a fertile ground for conflict theory application. Now, examples such as like the dowry system, honor-based violence, gendered economic dependency all reflect systemic control. Now, when you frame Asian feminism, you need to focus on the fact that it's intersectional feminism, where it's tailored to cultural realities which sort of challenge the patriarchal system without compromising sensitivity to societal dynamics. Now, the core burden on the government side is to essentially prove that the feminist conflict theory offers more comprehensive lens to deconstruct Asia's systemic gender oppression and to also mobilize societal transformation. So on the opposition's end, I think the core burden would be where you have to argue that alternative approaches such as individual agency, cultural relativism, or economic development are sort of more pragmatic and effective in driving change. Now, when you characterize the problem, you can use multiple approaches, but this is how I went about it. So one is on the idea that the patriarchy is a systemic barrier, where you talk about like how gender inequality is reproduced through political, economic, cultural, and familial structures, where you sort of institutionalize male privilege. A core example would be on this idea that there is underrepresentation of women in policy making, where it limits gendered reforms, and this obviously perpetuates a patriarchal inertia, right? So another thing that you can talk about is on the reality of intersectional feminism, where you have to talk about gendered oppression and how that sort of overlaps with caste, religion, class, and ethnicity, right? Sort of creates this multidimensional vulnerability or multidimensional vulnerabilities. An example there would be like the Dalit women in India facing compounded discrimination, where like oppression is not only because of their gender but also because of their caste, which traps them in this systemic poverty and violence. Another thing that you can talk about is how culture is used as this tool of legitimization, where harmful traditions such as child marriages, honor killings, reproductive coercion, female genital mutilation are framed as cultural norms. We talk about how culture is also used as a tool of legitimization, where harmful traditions such as female genital mutilation, where things like child marriage, honor killings, and even reproductive coercion are framed as cultural norms. This discourages reform under the guise of preserving tradition. Another thing that should be highlighted is the consequence of inaction. Without systemic framework, feminism risks fragmentation, where you address the symptoms but not really the root cause. This perpetuates further inequality under modern guises. To move into the second portion of this video, which is arguments for both opposition and proposition. Now, the government has to talk about three things. One, on the idea that patriarchy is systematic. Second is on the idea that empowerment happens through systemic framing. The third is on the idea that Asia's cultural and economic realities demand the conflict theory. Moving into the first substantive. Now, the claim here is that gender inequality is not a byproduct of individual behaviors, but a deliberately embedded structure of power, sustained across generations. Now, within this claim, some things that you should focus on is on the structural continuity. This is where institutions like the state, family, economy, and religion interlock to normalize male dominance, where there is political underrepresentation for women, where there is exclusion of women from legislative processes which prevent systemic redressal. An example would be Asia having one of the lowest female parliamentary representations globally. The second is on this idea of economic marginalization, where women are underpaid or undervalued in terms of labor, where they further reinforce economic dependency and also powerlessness, right? Another idea that you should ideally focus on is on normative reproduction, where social norms teach women compliance and blame them for inequality. Without structural analysis, obviously the oppression is invisible, right? And reforms appear unnecessary. A primary example for this would be victim blaming in cases of sexual violence, which stems from patriarchy embedding women's honor in male control. This is one of the problematic things that you should ideally highlight within this substantive, right? Now, the impact of this is where you're reorganizing systemic patriarchy, and when you do that, it unveils the root causes of gender inequality, laying the groundwork for large-scale structural change, be it reforms, be it ideologies or social norms. You're paving the way for large-scale change. Now, the second is on empowerment through systemic framing. Now, the claim here is that you identify the patriarchy as a system that enables collective mobilization rather than isolating women's struggles as individual failures. Now, a little bit of analysis for this is on this idea of reclaiming agency. Like a systemic lens shifts blame from individuals to oppressive institutions, empowering women to fight collectively. For example, Nirbhaya's protests in India mobilized millions because of the sexual violence that was also framed as this societal disease, and they also understood that it roots from patriarchal norms. Now, another thing that you should ideally bring up is on this idea that there's solidarity across movements. This theory links gender oppression to other struggles like class, caste, and economic justice, where it creates broad-based movements that are capable of sustained impact. Now, the impact here is pretty simple. There's a systemic approach that fosters unity and also momentum for feminist movements, which drives institutional reforms rather than like placemat solutions. Now, the third substantive or like the third argument that I had in mind is on Asia's cultural and economic realities that demand the conflict theory, right? Now, the claim is where, in contexts where like cultural norms weaponize tradition to justify inequality, feminist conflict theory becomes essential for cultural critique and also reform. Now, analysis here is, obviously there's a lot of analysis, but some things that you should have ideally touched on is on the cultural entrenchment, right? Practices like dowry, honor killings, and male primacy in inheritance laws that normalize inequality. So without systemic framing or cultural relativism, it doesn't shield women, it shields the patriarchy from critique, perpetuating harm under the guise of respecting tradition. For example, in South Asia, honor killings are looked at as preserving family dignity, which obviously obscures their systemic roots in patriarchy. So now I'll be talking about two arguments that opposition could use. First is on oversimplification ignores cultural nuance. Second is that individual agency is central to progress. On the first substantive, the claim is where the conflict theory imposes this Western lens that fails to account for the diversity and complexity of Asian societies. We can talk about cultural relativism, where Asian traditions are diverse and historically rooted. Blanket critiques risk alienating local communities, making it difficult for reformation to happen. For example, critiquing arranged marriages without acknowledging their evolving nature delegitimizes feminist voices, right? For example, there's voluntary matchmaking and things like that. And the second idea is on the fact that you prefer pragmatism over ideology, where you sort of focus on cultural sensitivity and incremental reform because it achieves tangible progress without antagonizing communities. And I think that's important, right? Because this is the kind of intersectionality that the Western lens fails to sort of identify. And this is the problem that you should ideally push. Now, the second substantive, which is on like individual agency, the claim is pretty simple, right? Where you talk about systemic framing and how this reduces women becoming passive victims, undermining their agency to drive change. So one is on the focus of agency, right, where women are active participants in societal change, where movements succeed when women's agency is celebrated, not framed solely as resistance to oppression, right? Now, an example here would be like women-led microfinance initiatives, empowering communities economically without relying on systemic overhaul. A second idea is on economic development as an equalizer. So you prioritize things like education, economic opportunities, access to resources, and this essentially resulting in women being more empowered and more effective than ideological battles, because you go back to this idea of development being better than blame pushing. Now to move into the third and final section of today's video, which is clashes and strategy. So the clashes would be, is the patriarchy best understood as systemic? Now the government obviously has to talk about how structural analysis exposes root causes and also drives systemic reforms, and obviously the government will talk about how there's oversimplification and how this ignores cultural complexity and alienates communities. Now the winning strategy for government is to prove that cultural relativism is weaponized to justify inequality and that systemic framing empowers women to fight collectively. And the winning strategy for op is to show that a nuanced, pragmatic approach achieves faster and also more inclusive progress. Another clash would be on this idea of whether the theory empowers women or not. Now the government has to talk about how systemic framing enables solidarity and collective mobilization, shifting the blame from individuals to institutions. And the winning strategy for Gov is to highlight movements like the Nirbhaya protest, where systemic framing united women and achieved reform. Now for opposition, I think you need to focus more on how it risks portraying women as victims, where you undermine their agency and ignore individual-driven solutions. The winning strategy for opposition is to emphasize on real-world examples where agency and economic empowerment drives progress. But yeah, that's about it in terms of that second clash. Now in terms of the third clash, I think focus has to go into what approach is most effective in Asia's context. The government has to sort of push this idea that systemic critique challenges harmful traditions and economic inequality at their roots. Now, the strategy here is to argue that without systemic analysis, cultural and economic barriers remain unchallenged. Now, OP has to essentially talk about how there's incremental cultural sensitive reforms that achieve practical and sustainable change. And if you prove that ideologically rigid approaches alienate communities and hinder tangible progress, I think it's good enough for you to win. But that's about it in terms of my video today. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.